When we're dealing with international issues and we're dealing with international trade, in one of our last classes, we dealt with the idea of terms of trade. We sort of like jumped ahead. But with that knowledge, जब हम इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड की बात कर रहे होते हैं, तो we know that we're dealing with exports and imports. And we want to figure out that if a country wants to do trade, what is the reason behind it, right? So the chapter really in Bamford also it starts with the reason of for international trade, um, and that will eventually take us towards an argument of should we go for a free trade situation or should we go towards protectionism and reasonable questions. Free trade के ऊपर तो individually so far two questions have come. जो purely free trade क्या होता है advantages and disadvantages. None of in our variant 22 के अंदर जून और नवंबर but March के अंदर जरूर आ चुका है but you know that's not our variant. Um, so we'll deal with that little later. And then protectionism के ऊपर काफी reasonable questions भी आ चुके हैं. When we're dealing with the reasons as to should we specialize in something? ये free trade arguments के अंदर ये concept आ जाता है कि should a country specialize in something or should we produce everything? You know, the strategic argument. So, when we want to specialize in something, the two theories come into discussion. One is the absolute advantage theory versus the comparative advantage theory, right? So far, only one question has come which deals with like definitions of absolute and comparative. We'll take a look at that. In just a bit कि ये principles of absolute or comparative advantage theory होते क्या है and then eventually if there are any limitations to it or if they are the best ones and then we write an essay on that. फिर उसके बाद 8 मार्कर का तो so far एक ही question आया है. Mostly जो questions अभी तक आए हैं they're 12 markers. So we'll look at all of them today. All right. So I'll try to explain the definitions and all using this particular essay. So ये सबसे पहला 2023 के अंदर जब आपका सिलेबस चेंज होता है क्वेश्चन स्ट्रक्चरिंग चेंज होती है सो हमारे वेरिएंट में दिस क्वेश्चन केम अबाउट ओके so the question says that two countries each produce two products and wishes to trade with each other. Yeah, obviously, this is an assumption. जब हम absolute or comparative advantage theory को करते हैं, and you'll see in some of our essay that this assumption is very, very, very important. उसके बगैर आप इस theory को, proof करना थोड़ा मुश्किल हो जाता है. So there are two countries producing two goods each, and now they wish to trade with each other. Explain the difference between the principle of absolute advantage and comparative advantage. सही है, so that should be about 3 marks for you. And whether and consider whether the principle of comparative advantage is always the more important influence when each country is deciding whether to trade with each other or not. ठीक तो basically the second part जो आपका analysis है the analysis is going to deal with the advantages of comparative advantage but at the same time the disadvantages. Okay, so using Bamford, okay, so I'll try to blend in the two things, the marking scheme and Bamford ताकि हमारा theory भी cover हो जाए इसके अंदर. So सबसे पहले the difference between the absolute and comparative. So just to get a background on absolute advantage, I think couple of things though, you should always have in your answer about absolute advantage. The first thing is ये जो absolute advantage theory है, this is Adam Smith's doing. Okay, it is introduced by Adam Smith, and it basically occurs when a country can produce more of a good using the same resources than another country. ठीक है? So let's suppose दो countries हैं and we say कि okay, you have this much of this resource, you have this much of the other country has the same amount of the resources. And now we want to see with the set given resources, आप कितना produce कर सकते हैं और आप कितना produce कर सकते हैं. Whoever can produce more, ठीक है, with the given set of resources, we say that that country has the absolute advantage in a particular good. Okay. So I think इनकी जो relative set of resources की बात है, those are individually. Like अगर हम example की बात करें and we say कि okay, um, who can produce more rice? Can Pakistan produce more rice or can India produce more rice? Now, based on the resources India has and based on the resources Pakistan has, now you have to keep in mind the climate, the labor, the capital, the land available, the fertility of the land available. Obviously, Pakistan probably might have lesser and they might have more, right? So, with this given set of individual countries' resources, who can produce more rice? And probably India can do a better job. They can produce in numbers more than us. So we can say, okay, India has an absolute advantage in rice, while we don't. ठीक है, but we may have the comparative. उसको हम फिर बाद में देखेंगे based on the opportunity cost ratios. So जब हम absolute advantage को define करेंगे, so if I was to do, um, this is how I'll define it. Okay, so absolute advantage. Let me just use a little abbreviations. Absolute advantage is a situation. I'm taking it from Bamford, by the way. Is a situation where for a given set of resources, one country can produce more of a particular good than another country, right? So this is the definition. You should get at least like 1 mark for this. ठीक, that what is absolute advantage? Okay. So Adam Smith basically simply said कि अगर हमें international trade करना है, तो countries with a given set of resources, how much of one product can they produce, and how much of with their other countries' resources, how much can they produce? Let's see who has absolute advantage. If one country has absolute advantage in one type of a good, and the other country has absolute advantage in another type of a good, so each should produce individually. Now, I'm going to go into the theory, but just for the explanation purpose, but ज़रूरी नहीं है कि you have to do it through tables and all. Okay, a lot of students they choose to do it. The only advantage of you doing it in that way is कि you know थोड़ा सा when you are working with these tables and all, you end up doing a better job in the explanation. So, for example, I'll take the example from again from Bamford, where they are proposing that there are two countries. There is Indonesia and there is Brazil, and both are looking in terms of rice and coffee. ठीक है? And they say that with the given set of resources before specialization, Indonesia can produce like 500 rice and about 200 coffee. And Brazil, जो है, it can produce 200 rice and about 500 coffee. Obviously, this is before specialization. And this is a few things that you have to see, and you can look at my much detailed lectures जो MCQ के अंदर deal करते हैं. That is this table showing that 50-50 resource split हुआ है, or am I like looking at the specialization? What I mean by is Indonesia, spelling is wrong, you can fix it. अगर Indonesia अग- सारे resources, all they have, okay, with the given island size and weather and being in the south or the north and whatever of the equator. तो उस हिसाब से if they put all their resources in rice, they can produce 500 tons. If they move all of their resources towards coffee, they can produce maximum 200. Okay? But on the other hand, Brazil, if they put all of their resources in rice, they produce maximum of 200. And if they move all of their resources over here, they can produce 500. Sometimes in MCQs, you're going to come across a situation where they're going to see कि ये जो numbers हैं, that is a 50-50% split of the resources. That with the 50% they can make 500, and with another 50% they can make 200. तो अगर आप स्पेशलाइज करते हैं तो दिस नंबर बिकम्स टाइम्स टू विच इज लाइक इसके रिसोर्सेज भी जब यहाँ मूव हुए 50% resources के साथ if I was making 500 with double resources, coffee के resources comes here, it becomes times two and you can produce 1,000 of it. But if you take rice के resources over there, times two, you can make 400 of that. तो ये मैं दूसरे lectures के अंदर काफी डिटेल में इस बात को explain किया हुआ है. This might be relevant for your MCQ. Right now, I'm assuming with specialization, 100% resources, what can you get? Okay, moving on. So Adam Smith theory is very simple. It says, okay, who makes more rice? Indonesia does. Who makes more coffee? They do. So that means Indonesia has absolute advantage in rice and they have absolute advantage in coffee. That's how specialization should work, and that is how output can be produced. Okay? तो यहाँ पे इन्होंने 50-50% रिसोर्सेज के साथ इस बात को आर्ग्यू किया है. So therefore, after specialization, the world is going to have about 1,000 rice and about 1,000 coffee. ठीक है, क्योंकि वो टाइम्स टू हो जाएगा जब रिसोर्सेज मल्टीप्लाई हो जाएंगे. Ignoring specialization and economies of scale and everything. We'll talk about that as we go on. So this is the concept of absolute advantage. But then comes David Ricardo. Okay, he's you can say a follower of Adam Smith. Okay, but comes a little later, and he proposes a situation where what if one country has absolute advantage in both the goods? Okay, so let's suppose Indonesia or Brazil का ही case लेके चलते हैं. And from the table's point of view, let me just give you a table and then I'll move forward. Same concept, rice and coffee, and then you have Indonesia and Brazil. But we want to show a situation where, let's say, um, Indonesia can produce uh, 500 of this and say 200 of this, whereas Brazil can make 200 of this and just 100 of this. Okay. Now, looking at absolute advantage theory, we're going to see, okay, who makes more rice with a given set of resources? Indonesia can produce more. Who can make more coffee? Okay, Indonesia can make more. तो यहाँ क्या problem हो गई that Indonesia has absolute advantage in both the goods, while Brazil has no absolute advantage. So now what can we do? So this is where David Ricardo comes in and he says, even in this situation, there is a way that we can, turn the situation around and countries can actually still benefit from specialization and trade. So we will explain it like this. I'll take it from again from Bamford that a comparative advantage is a situation where a country can produce a product at a lower opportunity cost than another country. Something to do with efficiency here. Obviously, जब हम बात करते हैं, one country can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than the other. What that means is that now we want to make a comparison between the countries that if Indonesia chooses to produce one rice, how many how many coffee did it have to give up in order to produce that one rice? And if Indonesia decides to produce a coffee, then to make a coffee, how much rice did they have to give up? And similarly, we'll do the same thing for Brazil. Like, for example, Brazil can make 200 coffee, or the अगर मैं और situation करता हूँ और situation नहीं करता हूँ and we say कि okay, if they specialize in coffee rice they can produce 200, and if they specialize in coffee they can make just 100. So it means that if they are producing one rice, they're only giving up half a coffee. That's very little. But if they choose to produce one coffee, they're going to end up giving up two rice for that. Now that's a higher opportunity cost. Okay. So again, let me just explain it through this first, and then I'll go into it. Assuming that these are based on 100% resources. Okay. Unlike Uberwala case. So from an Indonesian's point of view, the equation is that they can produce 500 rice or 200 coffee. So if they choose to produce one rice, you take the 500 on the other side and 2 over 5. So if you divide 200 divided by 500, we get 0.4 coffee. But if they produce one coffee, they are going to end up uh, giving up about 2.5 rice. ये इनका इक्वेशन हो गया. Then Brazil के केस के अंदर they can make 200 rice or 100 coffee. So one rice is equals to half a coffee and one coffee is equals to two rice. Okay. So based on this, I hope you know how I did the calculation. So क्योंकि हम comparative advantage पढ़ रहे हैं, तो we want to see comparatively Brazil versus Indonesia, comparatively who is better in producing rice and then I will include this discussion of mine in my essay. I think we should. So, who can produce rice at lower opportunity cost? As per my definition on the left, the countries can produce it at a lower opportunity cost than the other country. Okay, then the other country becomes important. So, rice zero point 0.4 versus zero point 0.5. So, Indonesia has a lower opportunity cost in rice. Then you make a comparison. Okay, what about coffee? Who is producing at lower opportunity cost? Brazil is. Okay, one thing to remember, even when you're doing MCQs and you're doing calculations, if it turns out कि both countries, sorry, एक ही country को comparative advantage wise, like if this number I did the calculation and this number was 1.5, the rest was all the same. Um, so what that would have meant कि 1.5 is less than 2, तो इसके पास comparative advantage दोनों में आ जाता. Keep in mind that means you have made a calculation error. One country can have absolute advantage in both the goods, but it cannot have comparative advantage in both the goods. That means you've done calculation error. One country has to have comparative in one, and the other one has to have comparative in the other. So I will actually put that of an explanation as part of my essay as well. Okay. So I would write something like, uh, let me see if Bamford is explaining it in that way. Because ये वो opportunity cost ratio की बात आ जाती है. I don't know. हो सकता है probably in the explanation it might be saying something like this. So our explanation could be that a country can have absolute advantage in both goods while in both the goods while another country may not have absolute advantage in both goods. However, uh, one country will always have a lower opportunity cost in one of those goods will always have a lower opportunity cost in one of those goods while the other will have lower opportunity cost in the other good. So something along this line. It's up to you how you want to write it, but I think it might be an important one. I to also prefer to talk about stuff like why would a country have a lower opportunity cost in one of the goods, and it's dependent on the factor endowments. We like this word factor endowments. It's mentioned in the marking scheme many, many, many times, but it's simply factor endowment simply means the availability of the factors of production. Every country has a different availability of factors of production. So, that gives them that lower opportunity cost advantage. In fact, even absolute के terms के अंदर भी हो if a country has more like mountains and things like that, while the other country has more like flat. One country has less rain, other has more rain. So it can have natural resources. It can even have developed resource. One country trained and educated its people, its human resource more, while the other one did not. So ye bhi, so in fact, endowments could be naturally God gifted, and it could be one of those that you have created over a period of time. तो उसकी वजह से you basically get your absolute and comparative advantage. ठीक हो गया? So I think this would be like the first part of the essay where we want to make a comparison of क्योंकि उसने बोला है ना difference between absolute and comparative. So I think that's a reasonable one definition absolute, one definition for comparative, and difference के अंदर another difference is कि one country can have absolute advantage in both goods while the other one may not, and one country has to have comparative and the other one has to have comparative in the other. It is impossible that one country has absolute comparative in both while the other one has zero comparative advantage. It's just not possible. If it's happening, there's something. Then we look at the question more. What do we have to consider? Consider whether the principle of comparative advantage is always the more important influence when each country is deciding whether to trade with each other. Okay, so principle of comparative advantage, what, why should we consider it? What is the important bit in it? थोड़े से pointers के अंदर I can deal with this. When we are talking about absolute and comparative advantage, obviously we are talking about if a country should specialize. Should we go for specialization? Okay. Now, obviously, if you are going through it, you are specializing. And when you are specializing, we know that that means that we are going towards a more efficient allocation of resources. Okay, so that's a better use of the resources. When you have a more efficient allocation of resources, that means that there is more total output produced. And if we are producing more total output, that obviously means that the country's standards of living is going to increase. And if more goods are being produced, more employment is being generated, probably more incomes are being earned. And so, in that way, the country is better off, the people are better off. So, clearly, that would suggest that, overall things are much more better. Okay. Uh, and one of the good advantages of specialization and then trade is that initially you were not able to produce a large quantity, but now by specialization and focusing on one good and doing trade, now countries can actually consume beyond their production capacity. ये थोड़ा सा ट्रेडिंग पॉसिबिलिटी कर्व के कॉन्सेप्ट में मैं जा रहा हूँ. आई थिंक अभी तक ट्रेडिंग पॉसिबिलिटी कर्व के ऊपर कोई क्वेश्चंस नहीं आए हैं. I think I will also upload one of those lengthier lectures on the trading possibility curve in our course loads. So do take a look at that also. I think you never know कि कब वो important हो जाए. MCQs में plenty of times they test you. Okay. All right. So एक तरफ because we have to do consider की बात कर रहे हैं तो एक point के ऊपर we're talking about specialization and how it can benefit. दूसरी type तरफ we can talk about specialization के disadvantage, and one of the disadvantage we do talk about it is an idea of over specialization. अब concept क्या है? Brazil in like over here, that Indonesia should focus on rice only, and Brazil should focus on कॉफी ओनली राइट ये हमारा एक कॉन्टेक्स्ट में बात हो रही थी अब इशू ये है कि इफ यू डू दिस देन दैट मीन्स द कंट्री इज ओवर स्पेशलाइजिंग इन वन ऑफ दीज गुड्स एंड दैट मे लीड टू exhaustion of factors of production and that means that अगर आपके resources deplete हो जाएंगे so now you have fewer resources, खास तौर पे जो non-renewable resources हैं, you're going to have lesser of those for the future generations. And then maybe in the future, when your resources run out, then you won't be able to export these goods anymore. And now you can't even like produce other goods in your country because you've been relying on one good for such a long time. And so that sort of like creates an issue. फिर एक हम बाद में करेंगे प्रोटेक्शनिज्म थ्योरी के अंदर the whole idea of the strategic argument. Like for example, let's take the current example, the whole idea of Iran. Would Iran survive these attacks locally? So one of the strategic arguments that we saw in the Iran's case in the 1970s was after the whole regime change and all was that we will have to become self-sufficient and we have to rely on our own production and consumption because if the world puts sanctions on us, then how will we survive? So let's take Iran's case and Pakistan's case right now. So Iran was attacked because they've been sanctioned so much for the last 30, 40 years, they have become self-sufficient. Do they have everything? Well, maybe not, but they have become self-sufficient in medicine, in food, in weapons, right? So they can sustain any kind of further sanctions on them. Whereas if, God forbid, Pakistan goes into trouble right now and we are sanctioned, would we be able to survive in terms of the food and the weapons and the medicine and all? Because we heavily rely on import and all. So we have more tendency towards free trade while Iranis don't because of the sanctions. The strategic argument becomes that when you are relying a lot on specialization and trade, then these strategic arguments come into play. And for you, that may not be a very good thing. Strategic ज्यादातर फूड डिफेंस मेडिसिन ये सर्वाइवल वाली चीजों के अंदर आ जाती है so that can be one of the disadvantage we can talk about. Uh, let me introduce another idea over here. Uh, कि क्या हम इस थ्योरी पे completely rely कर सकते हैं or not? Because it is mentioned in the marking scale. Okay, we can go around it also, but let me just explain. We have an opportunity over here. So our idea was that okay, based on comparative advantage, you should focus on rice and I should focus on coffee, and this is how we're going to go about it. But sometimes when you are doing trade, we don't have common currency, so exchange rate का एक issue आ जाता है. Okay. So the argument they want to make is for the counter is that maybe the exchange rate may not lie between the opportunity cost ratios. What does that mean? एक सेकंड ऊपर आते हैं हम दोबारा इसके ऊपर. Number one, opportunity cost ratios क्या होती हैं? Okay, opportunity cost ratios is what we worked out over here. Okay, Indonesia can produce 500 rice or 200 coffee. So the opportunity cost ratio of rice is that they will have to give up zero point 0.4 coffee. And the opportunity cost ratio of coffee is they will have to give up 2.5 rice. Okay. So opportunity cost ratio क्या होता है? That what do you have to give up in order to produce one of this unit? When you are trading with each other, your intention is that Indonesia is producing rice. So if they focus on rice and produce 500 rice, if you want to encourage them to do trade with Brazil, Brazil will have to offer them something more than zero point 0.4. Something greater than zero point 0.4 has to be offered for Indonesia to accept the trade. So if they offer them zero point 0.5 coffee, zero point 0.5 coffee, okay, Indonesia will take zero point 0.5 coffee because they were only able to produce zero point 0.4. So anything more than zero point 0.4 acceptable to them. Okay. Whereas if Brazil is making coffee and they give up two rice to make one coffee, if you offer them two rice, they will not do the trade. They have to be offered something more than two rice, maybe like 2.5, maybe 2.1, 2.2, 2. Anything more than two is acceptable. Does not matter how much more it is. Acceptable term of the more the better, obviously. But even like 2.05 is an acceptable rate for them. Okay. So that is something called the terms of trade. Now remember, in our previous lecture, we did terms of trade, but that was in terms of the price ratio of exports and imports. Now that's a separate thing. The term of trade का concept which I am talking about over here, कि एक राइस के बदले में कितना coffee is acceptable, that's a separate thing. So when essays come about, be a little mindful कि ये कौन से टर्म ऑफ ट्रेड की बात हो रही है. इज इट द प्राइस रेशियो वन और इज इट इन टर्म्स ऑफ एब्सोल्यूट एंड कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज थ्योरी? ऑलराइट, बिकॉज इससे बिल्कुल डिफरेंट कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम चले जाते हैं. बिकॉज आई हैव सीन एसेज जिसके अंदर बच्चे टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड को एक्चुअली ये वाला टर्म ऑफ ट्रेड कंसिडर कर रहे हैं कि एक राइस के बदले में कितना कॉफी और एक कॉफी के बदले में कितना राइस. वो अगर तुम हमारे प्रीवियस थ्योरी के हिसाब से करते द प्राइस रेशियोज, then that's absolutely wrong. You've just completely taken it in a different context. So terms of trade has two contexts. One is this and one is the price uh, ratios वाली बात. Okay, moving on. अब बात ये हो रही है, you know, it's quite possible that both these countries see कि okay, opportunity cost wise, we are lower, so we should make rice, and opportunity cost wise, we are lower in coffee, so we should focus on coffee. But हुआ ये, they focused on rice, they focused on coffee. जब trade करने की बात आई, when you look at the exchange rate data, turns out कि वो जो एक्सचेंज रेट मनूवरिंग के बाद वी रियलाइज दैट वो एडवांटेज तो खत्म हो गया विच वी वर सपोज टू गेट, क्योंकि एक्सचेंज रेट वाइज वन कंट्री वाज स्ट्रॉन्गर एंड द अदर वन वाज वीकर. तो जब हमने मॉनेटरी एक्सचेंज किया उसमें एक्सचेंज रेट की बेसिस पे, तो वी रियलाइज यू नो व्हाट, इट इज एक्चुअली कॉस्टिंग अस द सेम एज व्हाट वी कुड हैव प्रोड्यूस्ड. तो फिर आफ्टर एक्सचेंज रेट व्हाट यू रियली गेटिंग इज 0.54 कॉफी. So you realize that, you know what, after putting in the opportunity cost, like ये opportunity cost distance कितना है? 0.1 का है, right? So exchange rate से वो 1.1 जो है वो बैलेंस हो जाता है. इसको मैं बहुत सिंपल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में समझा देता हूँ. Pakistan and China trades with each other. A Pakistani sitting in Pakistan looks at, okay, so China is producing something at much more cheaper uh, opportunity cost, lower opportunity cost than us. It's a stupid idea to produce it locally. We should buy it from China, right? Lekin, when we do the exchange rate comparison in terms of dollars, because we trade between dollars, या फिर if we look at even the transportation cost, that after shipping from that country into Pakistan, turns out कि शिपिंग कॉस्ट जब हम लगाते हैं तो टर्न्स आउट इट्स बेटर दैट वी प्रोड्यूस इट इन पाकिस्तान। या फिर अगर हमारी लेट्स सपोज कंट्रीज में टैरिफ लग रहे होते हैं, राइट, विच हमेशा लगता है जब भी कोई प्रोडक्ट चाइना से पाकिस्तान आता है, देयर इज अ टैरिफ विच इज इन्वॉल्व। तो जब हम उस टैरिफ को अपनी कॉस्ट में बिल्ट इन करते हैं तो वी रियलाइज दैट दैट प्रोडक्ट इज एक्चुअली लोकल बनाने में ही एडवांटेज है, right? So that means the Chinese have to produce it way more at an efficient level than us. Even after transportation cost, even after the exchange rate, even after the tariffs, okay? तो ये तीनों चीजों को भी जब हम factor in कर लेते हैं, turns out that if China is still we have an advantage, then we should import that particular product. Right? Now we're going into a little realistic realm over here. Okay, realistically, if you only look at comparative advantage theory and look at these numbers, you would say, कि हाँ जी, opportunity cost is lower, we should get. But realistically, when you factor in exchange rate, transportation, and tariffs, turns out that it might not be advantageous to us anymore. जैसे हम गाड़ियों के अंदर ही आप देख लें कि when we're getting cars from Japan, तो जब हम अपनी ड्यूटीज उसके अंदर ऐड करते हैं, राइट, सो टर्न्स आउट दैट दैट कार इज इक्विवेलेंट टू अ लोकल कार, राइट, इवन आफ्टर द एक्सचेंज रेट एंड ऑल। तो वो अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट रेशियोज अगर ऑफसेट हो जाता है बिकॉज ऑफ दीज रीजंस, देन देयर इज नो पॉइंट ट्रेडिंग। तो यहाँ पर जो ओवर स्पेशलाइज जो हम काउंटर कर रहे हैं कि कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज थ्योरी may not be advantages. One argument they're making is कि अगर आपका exchange rate may not lie between the opportunity cost ratios. If it's more, then there is no advantage. ये exchange rate को हटा के तुम transportation cost भी लिख सकते हो, तुम tariffs को भी लिख सकते हो, and it will be acceptable. So there are a lot of things. Remember, ये guidance के point of view से है। um, इसकी अगर जब हम मार्किंग स्कीम देखते हैं तो मार्किंग स्कीम, लेट मी जस्ट गो टू द मार्किंग स्कीम फॉर अ सेकंड। It says over here points to consider includes now the note to the examiners that this list is not exhaustive to allow any recent point. That means that students can come up with more reasons, which I have talked about in terms of the tariffs and the transportation cost. So those are also acceptable ones, so you can. What you need to be focusing on is that your answer needs to talk about the advantage of using comparative advantage theory and also have disadvantage. If you can think of more disadvantages, that's fine, no problem. But maximum of 2 marks you can get for the disadvantages and 1 mark for advantage. Okay? अब जहां तक इसकी इवैल्यूएशन की बात आ जाती है, evaluation is about the judgment. Let me just go back to the question for a second. The question says, more important influence, uh, whether the principle of comparative advantage is always the more important influence when each country is deciding. तो obviously जब हम evaluation के अंदर जाएंगे so, our evaluation should look at both the advantages and the disadvantages. If your evaluation is not looking at both sides, we have a problem. So you have to consider both. Okay, so we could say something like that comparative advantage is usually a more important influence because it explains how countries can so because it explains how a country can gain from trade through specialization. However, it is not always the most important factor, as governments must also consider strategic, environmental, and economic risks when deciding whether to trade. Um, even they have to look at, you can actually do this also. ये जो अभी recent, I think ये जो पूरा US China trade war, in fact US trade war with the whole world just happened. I think that would be a fantastic explanation that even like these geopolitical situations where if the countries start putting tariffs on each other, then like for example, when the US started putting tariffs on the Chinese goods, then the whole absolute comparative advantage theory kind of like fails because then after tariffs, those advantages just goes away. you know तो मेरे ख्याल में रियलिस्टिकली आर आंसर्स अभी हम एक 12 मार्कर जब देखेंगे ना तो you're going to see much more wider context के अंदर when we'll make these comparisons that comparative advantage की एक अपने advantages हैं in terms of more output and more efficient use of resources, but it does not look at the limitations. One real world में there are a lot of limitations that we have to factor in. Okay? So, उसके लिए I'll show you दो questions जो आए हैं ना अभी तक. एक November 23, 21. So let me go to that question. Yeah, one is this one, November 23, 3, question 5B. Yeah, it's actually question 5B. Okay. So take a look at this one, because ये वाला question,
Do you have country examples?
let's say कि analysis के अंदर the kid is doing a disadvantage of comparative advantage, and they may say that the comparative advantage does not look at those factors which offset the opportunity cost. Now it's too vague, you know कि ओके ऑफसेटिंग अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट की बात हुई है एंड विच इज फाइन, बट एग्जाम्पल के अंदर देन द किड सेज दैट फॉर एग्जाम्पल बिटवीन द यूएस एंड द चाइना, व्हेन यूएस imposed tariffs on the Chinese goods, तो वो tariffs की वजह से it offsetted the opportunity cost advantage, so therefore comparative advantage theory will not always succeed, yeah, is not always the best one to do because realistically you have other things. So you see, it was too vague in the theoretical part, but the example pinpointed me towards, okay, he's talking about कि वो tariff की वजह से जो है opportunity cost offset हो सकती है. So you should always do examples. I know it takes time, um, but देखो वॉल्यूम भी आ जाता है आपके ऐसे में और क्लैरिटी भी क्रिएट हो जाती है. But then your examples should be very clear and pinpoint also. Sometimes kids, their examples are also so complicated that, it just clarity. Like examiners have always said, please, अगर आप उनकी वो भी meetings वगैरह के अंदर, I have uploaded some of these lectures जहाँ examiners की meeting के अंदर जब उन्होंने हमें discussion किया and they spoke about, they used this word car, that please explain to your students that your essays should um, take this abbreviation of CAR: clarity, accuracy, relevancy. Okay, so your answer should have these three things in it, not vagueness and all. Sometimes kids write too much, and it's like whole different. They're mixing like sociology and psychology and business studies into economics and their answer writing. Don't do that. Be
How is the data verified?
Datas are not verified. No, datas are not verified. Even when the questions are based on your country, do something, something. Number one, examiners don't know which country you're from. They're not supposed to know. Sometimes they do find out based on, जब आप एक्स्ट्रा शीट्स लगाते हो तो स्कैंट्रॉन्स के अंदर, स्कैंट्रॉन्स में द फर्स्ट पेज इज नॉट देयर, तो we're not supposed to know where this paper is coming from. बट समटाइम्स जब आप शीट्स लगाते हो, एक्स्ट्रा शीट्स, तो उसके अंदर स्टैंप आ जाता है, तो स्टैंप से हमें पता लग जाता है ओके दिस इज फ्रॉम दिस रीजन. But examiners cannot bias on that. Examiners don't have the knowledge of all the countries in the world. If somebody is writing कि Mauritius के अंदर ये हो रहा है, now I don't know as an examiner कि क्या हो रहा है, राइट. लेकिन अगर उस कंट्री को लेके द इकोनॉमिक थ्योरी वाला पार्ट को वो सही क्लैरिटी के साथ एक्सप्लेन करते हैं, दैट लेट्स सपोज इफ द स्टूडेंट इज राइटिंग कि मॉरिशस के अंदर बहुत हाई इन्फ्लेशन है. ना आई एम नॉट गोना गो इनटू गूगल एंड फाइंड आउट मॉरिशस में हाई इन्फ्लेशन थी कि नहीं थी. सो नो इश्यूज व्हाटसोएवर लाइक, ठीक है. एग्जामिनर्स आर नॉट सपोज टू नो दिस. ऑलराइट. सो दिस इज द क्वेश्चन नवंबर 23 के अंदर आया है. It is purely talking about assess whether the theory of absolute and comparative advantage are substantially undermined by their various limitations. Okay. Now, for a question like this, uh, 12 marker. Okay, we know how to write our 12 markers. 12 markers के अंदर um, one second, seem to have lost my pen. Okay, so basically, from the theory's point of view, we have to write our advantages. सबसे पहले तो I think थोड़ा सा brief दे दो absolute और comparative advantage theory के ऊपर, what it is. So I'll just steal it from the previous essay that I did. Um, so first, very little brief. By the way, maybe in our variant, they might give you mark for basic definitions of absolute and comparative. Maybe they may not. Okay. But I think we should give a brief definition of absolute and comparative advantage. Okay. So absolute advantage is developed by Adam Smith. It states that a country should specialize in producing goods it can produce more efficiently, meaning using fewer goods than other countries. By specializing and trading, total global output increases, allowing all countries to benefit from higher consumption. तो थोड़ा सा मैंने एब्सोल्यूट एडवांटेज के साथ मैंने उसके एडवांटेज भी डाल दिए. ठीक है. इसको अगर आप सेपरेटली करना चाहती हो, डू इट सेपरेटली. लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल लास्ट टाइम व्हाट डिड वी से, absolute advantage was introduced by Adam Smith. It is a situation in which, in a given set of resources, one country can produce more than the other country. You want to go through that, do that, कोई मसला नहीं है. Then the theory of comparative advantage was developed by David Ricardo. It argues that even if one country has an absolute advantage in producing all goods, trade can still be beneficial if country specializes in goods in which they have lower opportunity cost. This will also lead to more efficient. This will lead to more efficient use of resources and more output, and therefore improve the country's living standards. The thing is, when you define them, you also have to give advantage. After defining in simple terms, you can give the advantage, जो अभी हमने पीछे लिखे थे, the whole advantage of specialization, that you have more efficient use of factors production, you get more output, you get higher employment, right? You get higher consumption, consumption, you get higher standard of living. All these advantages you can write about. I think this will take you towards almost like a level two. Okay, depending on how well you expand on this, you can get up to level two, 4 marks. Yeah. फिर उसके बाद to go towards higher marks of level 2 or level 3, you have to write about the limitations. I'll just point out some of the limitations that we have, not restricting only, but to more. Remember, there were certain set of assumptions in the theory. The assumptions are that there are two countries in the world producing two goods. ये मैं पूरी listed है, even if you look at the notes. Assumption is that there are two countries in the world producing only two goods. Okay? Assumption is that the factors of production are perfectly mobile. ये मैं थोड़ा सा एक नया पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू लेकर आ रहा हूँ सो दैट हमारी थोड़ी सी थ्योरी भी हो जाए. Are perfectly mobile. What does that mean? What it meant is कि अगर इंडोनेशिया और Brazil are contemplating between rice and coffee, we are assuming that इंडोनेशिया के जो रिसोर्सेज हैं वो इजीली राइस से मूव कर सकते हैं और कॉफी में जा सकते हैं और कॉफी के रिसोर्सेज राइस में मूव कर सकते हैं. ओके, सेम गोज फॉर ब्राजील. मतलब लैंड, लेबर, कैपिटल, ऑल ऑफ दैम. ओके, वी आर अज्यूमिंग. अब एग्रीकल्चर के अंदर यूजली वी थिंक के ट्रैक्टर्स इजीली मोबाइल दोनों में यूज हो सकते हैं. लैंड दोनों में फर्टिलिटी, लैंड फर्टिलिटी दोनों में यूज हो सकती हैं. Labor to an extent, दोनों farmers हैं, but one might have specialty in coffee and one might have specialty in rice. अब you can't assume कि farmer है तो they have agriculturally, they have clear understanding of both. लेकिन perfect worlds में we do say कि हाँ जी, that's how it is. Okay? So resources. अब जब हम agriculture to manufactured, अगर हम अपने examples के अंदर एक तरफ rice ले लेते हैं और दूसरी तरफ t-shirts ले लेते हैं, so now there is a problem here because machines not perfectly compatible, labor not perfectly compatible, so वो realistic उसमें चला जाता है. यहाँ पर we're assuming factors of production are perfectly mobile. Not only that, we also assume that there is no transportation cost. तो जो भी चीज अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट की बेसिस पे हो रही है, कोई नो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कॉस्ट प्रॉब्लम्स एज सच कि पाकिस्तान और चाइना आपस में ट्रेड कर रहे हैं तो नो प्रॉब्लम व्हाटसोएवर. देयर इज नो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कॉस्ट इन्वॉल्व्ड. जब आप, क्योंकि अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम्स वी नो कि भाई जब चाइना से एक चीज पाकिस्तान शिप होके आएगी तो वी हैव टू ऐड सम थाउजेंड्स ऑफ डॉलर्स ऑन इट फॉर द शिपिंग एंड ऑल, एंड नाउ मे बी द अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट का एडवांटेज गोज अवे. सो नो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कॉस्ट, नो exchange रेट, क्या कहें, नो एक्सचेंज रेट, डिफरेंस कह लेते हैं चलो. नो टैरिफ्स व्हाटसोएवर. ये तीनों पॉइंट्स ऑलमोस्ट सिमिलर है लेकिन यू कैन एक्सप्लेन देम सेपरेटली. आई वुड ऑलवेज से कि इन तीन में से आप बेशक एक को कर लो और फिर बाकी कुछ और को बात करो. ओके, देयर इज ऑल्सो एन assumption that the quality is the same between the two goods and there is no consumer preference. Although we know in reality people do have preference because the quality cannot be the same. A Coca-Cola produced in UK and a Coca-Cola produced in Pakistan cannot be the same. Same goes for chocolate, and we can tell the difference because the water is different. Maybe some sort of certain quality of resources can change. The usage of resources can change. You know, we also assume that there is a constant return to scale. What do I mean? Economies of scale completely eliminated. You remember in मेरे previous question के अंदर जब मैं theory समझा रहा था, and we said कि sometimes in our table we do okay Indonesia and Brazil, rice and coffee. We assumed that the numbers we're getting 500 and 200 for Indonesia was कि 50% resource in this, 50% resource in this. But if we were moving our resources and making it 200, making 100 पूरा कर रहे थे resource on one side, so we were just doubling it. Okay. And so we said, okay, if 50% resource of resources can produce 500 rice, then if we specialize and bring coffee ka resources also over here, so now we can double it. So that means now we can produce 1,000 instead of 500 rice. So problem here is sometimes when you bring more resources into something, economies of scale can play a role, and instead of going from 500 to 1,000, we may go towards 500 say 1,200 or 1,300, something like this. Do you understand? तो ये बिल्कुल हो सकता है. um, ठीक. So anyhow, so that is another assumption. If you can think of more assumption, yeah, there is another one कि perfect knowledge होती है. So I think the way this can be written in terms of limitation is after just giving a few. Okay, don't give too many. Give a few. ठीक. And after giving them, we would like you to talk about कि भाई, in real world, what is going on. So we could say that in reality, these assumptions rarely hold. You know, trade involves many countries. तो इसको मैं counter करूंगा कि भाई दुनिया में तो there are many countries and each country produce many goods. So this does not hold. Okay. Also, हम ये भी बोल सकते हैं कि जो resources हैं, they are not perfectly mobile, especially जो primary sector versus secondary sector goods होते हैं, उसमें resources cannot just simply move about. Okay. फिर उसके बाद you can also talk about in reality, transportation cost भी होती हैं. Countries जो हैं वो free trade नहीं करती हैं, वो आपस में tariffs लगाती हैं. तो उसकी वजह से basically क्या हो रहा है कि वो जो हमारा opportunity cost ratios है, वो basically offset हो जाती हैं because of these reasons in reality. Right? And the quality is not the same. Sometimes consumers have preference of one type of a good over the other. Sometimes जब हम countries एक एक और point जो इन्होंने marking scheme में लिखा हुआ है, usually I don't teach that point as an assumption. We assume that जो businesses हैं, जो countries हैं और जो factor markets हैं, वो perfect competition में. I think this perfect competition actually sums it up in a very much better way. But क्योंकि AS में हमें एक O लेवल के अंदर हम perfect competition पढ़ाते हैं और A2s में हम perfect competition पढ़ाते हैं, AS में हम perfect competition नहीं पढ़ाते हैं. So kids who don't have O level background, they don't know what it is. एक आइडिया है जिसको हम कहते हैं कि फर्म्स या इंडस्ट्रीज परफेक्टली competitive है. Now, this two words, perfectly competitive, yeah, perfect competition, basically has a lot of features in it, like perfect mobility of resources, जो मैंने separately लिखा है. perfect knowledge. Consumers and producers have perfect knowledge at which countries are producing what goods, at what price, in what quantities, and using what machines. But in reality, we don't know. We know that China can produce something very cheap. Maybe African can produce it cheaper. कोई अफ्रीका के अंदर कोई farmer है which can produce it at even cheaper rates, but we don't know because we don't have perfect knowledge, right? So perfect mobility की बात हो गई, perfect knowledge की बात हो गई, no tariffs, all the firms are equally productive. We know in reality markets are imperfect and you have monopolies, you have government interventions which do not make everybody equal. जैसे for example, दुनिया में स्टील बहुत सारी कंट्रीज बनाती हैं, but चाइना का स्टील is the most you can say is the most efficient. लेकिन जो चाइना का स्टील प्रोडक्शन है वो स्टेट ओन्ड है, इट्स हाईली सब्सिडाइज्ड. So perfect competition में US can be producing steel, but they can't because government intervention है. तो perfect competition का clash आ जाता है with government intervention, and then you can say कि यहाँ तो distortion है. Same goes with tariffs and quotas and all sorts of theories that we have. Do we get it? So let's go back to the question and see if we've answered it. Assess whether the theories of absolute and comparative advantage are substantially undermined by various limitations. So we have explained the advantage of absolute and comparative advantage with their definitions. We have explained their assumptions, and we have talked about its limitations that it holds. But the question is, um, substantially undermines. Okay, so up for our evaluation, keeping in mind what we've written, obviously our evaluation should discuss both sides and then eventually come to our final conclusion. If I was to write my evaluation, this is what I would write. Let me just, read it out, something like this. That the limitations do weaken the reality of both theories. For example, the presence of transportation costs or barriers may reduce or even eliminate the gains, offset kar sakta hai. Or sometimes it can be even more, like gains from trade prediction by comparative advantage. Similarly, economies of scale may mean that countries specialize not because of opportunity cost differences, but because of cost advantage from large scale production. Let me explain this point. Because absolute advantage theory के अंदर हम कह रहे हैं कि जी इकोनॉमीज ऑफ स्केल तो है ही नहीं. अब होता क्या है? If you notice, Pakistan के अंदर Toyota Corolla produces limited variants of limited models. Toyota Corolla, Yaris, but they don't produce the smaller versions. Okay, they don't produce the Wits and the Jewel and all of these smaller Mira and these small versions of those cars. Or the large scale. Matlab, we don't produce the Prados and the Land Cruisers but we do produce Fortuner and Hilux, right? यहाँ पर our idea is not absolute comparative advantage, it is the cost side. If we focus on one particular model and produce plenty, our cost advantage is much more lower as compared to maybe in Land Cruiser. If we produce it locally, we don't have enough demand, we can't produce in a large scale. So maybe it's a smarter idea that we should focus on Fortuner in the big scale and the Hiluxes, like the Revo. But let's not do it on Land Cruiser and the Lexus, because we won't get that advantage. So this is what I'm talking about, that हमेशा opportunity cost का एडवांटेज कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज से आप नहीं देखते हैं. Sometimes it's the scale of the business which can actually give you the advantage. Okay, so मैंने क्या किया? मैंने अभी काउंटर किया. I started off my evaluation by saying कि भाई reality के अंदर comparative advantage की जो assumptions हैं उसके अंदर we do see that sometimes things happen differently. However, because I have to write about the advantages also, right? However, it would be incorrect to say that the theories are substantially undermined. Yeah, आप बिल्कुल ही disregard कर दो theory को. It does help us in some ways. It does help us determine that, we have this sort of factors of production and factor endowment. So we should produce this type of product more as compared to this type. For example, our weather complements and our geographic position complements us in the primary sector, and our lack of human resource या capital human resource आप कह लें तो because of the lack of machinery, capital stock, physical capital, it makes sense for us not to do too much in secondary and tertiary and focus more on primary. Now, this whole idea is coming from the comparative advantage theory, right? So we can't just simply say कि भाई, it is incorrect to say that the theory are substantially undermined despite their simplification. They do provide a powerful foundational framework for understanding international trade. I think this is something that you should learn for this particular essay for the backing of comparative. आपके पास simple advantages जो हैं वो हमने ऊपर लिख लिए हैं. More output, efficient resources utilization and all. But now we're talking more deeper points दैट कि ये तो फाउंडेशनल फ्रेमवर्क एक इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड का ये बेसिस कोर आइडिया को एक्सप्लेन करता है. सो द कोर आइडिया that specialization based on relative efficiency improves global welfare, remains highly relevant and is supported by real world trade patterns. अब आप explain example के through उसको explain करना चाहते हो, you can do it. Okay. So moreover, modern trade theory is built upon these models, okay, incorporating factors like scale economies and imperfect competition rather than replacing them entirely. So we have to, please, you have to write in your evaluation something concrete and add on because उन्होंने बोला significantly undermines and we've just proved कि foundational work के अंदर इसकी एक basis तो है. Okay. And then your final conclusion that while the assumption of absolute and comparative advantage limits their direct application, they do not substantially undermine the theory. Instead, these models remain essential for explaining the basic principles of trade. Um, and you may suggest, okay, for real worlds, you can build in some real world complexities. Like, for example, आपने absolute comparative advantage के through you found out the opportunity cost. उसके बाद आपने एक्सचेंज रेट की जो ऑफसेटिंग फैक्टर्स होते हैं या जो टैरिफ के ऑफसेटिंग फैक्टर्स होते हैं आप अपने मॉडल्स में इसको फर्दर बिल्ड इन करें एंड सी इफ द एडवांटेज इज स्टिल देयर और नॉट. यू नो लेट्स नॉट जस्ट कंप्लीटली शन द आइडिया कि व्हाट ये तो थ्योरी बिल्कुल फजूल है और बेकार है बिकॉज ये एब्सोल्यूट टर्म्स में या रियलिस्टिकली ये काउंट ही नहीं होती. ओके. सो दिस इज इट. एक और क्वेश्चन जो है question number that's June 25 235B, um, that deals with the government. Let me just show you the question. uh, by the way, एक question November 25 में भी आया हुआ है. If I show you that one, एक second, let me just show you that one also, क्योंकि it's very similar to the one that we've already dealt with just now. So let me just give you quick look at it, the question. Um, yeah, ये नवंबर में आया है. So this is recent one, but not in our variant. 24 के variant के अंदर आया है for Chinese. Um, Assess the extent to which the principle of comparative advantage should be the main factor to consider when countries decide to trade with each other. राइट. सो बहुत ही सिमिलैरिटी है इस पर्टिकुलर क्वेश्चन की. ठीक है, एब्सोल्यूट की कोई डिस्कशन नहीं है, प्योरली कंपैरेटिव का है. बट द की आइडिया स्टिल इज द सेम. कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज को डिफाइन करें, उसके एडवांटेजेस को डिफाइन करें, द वे वी जस्ट एक्सप्लेन्ड अ लिटिल व्हाइल अगो, स्पेशलाइजेशन और उसके एडवांटेजेस. फिर उसकी जो लिमिटेशंस हैं, द थ्योरी की वो जो लिमिटेशंस थी, और फिर उसका इवेल्युएशन शुड बी वेरी सिमिलर टू द वन दैट वी हैव एक्चुअली अभी जो मैंने तुम्हें एक्सप्लेन किया, कि यू कैन नॉट जस्ट कंप्लीटली शन द होल आइडिया ऑफ कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज. बट important thing to look at is this one. A one-sided response cannot gain marks for evaluation, which means कि अगर तुम्हारे यहाँ आंसर के अंदर I don't see any advantages, or if I don't see any limitations, because this is what a lot of times kids do. They just go into their essay and they start off with the limitations and they just give us the one-sided argument. Evaluation के marks goes very, very easily in that particular essay. ठीक हो गया. फिर जो जून की मैं बात कर रहा था, जून के अंदर जो क्वेश्चन इसका आया है, um, let me just show you that question. Um, yeah, this one. ये थोड़ा सा डिफरेंट है. इसमें गवर्नमेंट की पॉलिसीज कम इनटू प्ले ओवर हियर, where it says assess whether government policy can influence an economy's comparative advantage in a good. देखें जी, question is about government policies. Main focus is on government policy, but that doesn't mean that we don't talk anything about, that comparative advantage. You have to start off your essay with the basics of the government. Sorry, you explain the whole comparative advantage theory. You do the advantages of it. ठीक है, बहुत briefly, not too much. Okay. बस इतना करना है कि comparative advantage का एक overview idea आप explain कर. ठीक है, that the whole idea is based on the factor endowments, is based on the lower opportunity cost, and the whole idea of specialization and how the prices will fall, and all the efficiencies and all of that. But then how can government actually help countries gain comparative advantage? Like, for example, let's look at it this way. Let's say कि पाकिस्तान के केस के अंदर we have discovered that Pakistan has a lot of natural resources like copper and gold and natural oils and crude oil and all of this, and a lot of minerals and rare mineral earth and all of that. We've discovered it, right? Now, how can the country and their policy, sorry, how can the government and their policies can allow us to gain comparative advantage in it? Because right now we don't have it. Because right now our focus has always been on agriculture and cotton and textile. But now we feel ke yaar, you know what? हमने तो, you know, those large uh, earth moving machines, जो बड़े बड़े dynamites और trucks होते हैं, size of a house size के जो trucks होते हैं, जो आपको mining में चाहिए होते हैं, जो expertise mining में चाहिए होती है, we never focused on that. और उसके लिए पाकिस्तान usually relies on international countries to come into Pakistan, do joint ventures. We'll provide the land. They will bring in the expertise. They'll get 70-75%. We'll get 20-25%, 30%, And how can we do that? How can the government's policy encourage us? So the whole idea, I don't know if it's making sense, but mostly this is a supply side policy question in a way. how education and training, how infrastructural the government, how research and development, how infrastructure, how technology and its adaptation, how giving licenses government to the private sector, how the government can help those. So this particular question is more in terms of how the government can encourage. But remember, your essay needs to have a little understanding of government policy can influence the comparative advantage. First, in my opinion, you should write about a little bit of those comparative advantage concept for level one. फिर उसके बाद you go for तीन चार जितनी भी आपने बतानी है the policies. You can take a look at the policies over here because ये supply side है ना. We've already dealt with supply side. तो आपने क्या करना है कि वो सप्लाई साइड के साथ बट व्हाइल यू राइटिंग योर एसे मेक श्योर दैट यू कनेक्ट कि कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज के लिए द प्रोडक्टिविटी हाउ more supply can be done, how opportunity cost can be lowered. That's what this question requires. है ये सप्लाई साइड का लेकिन सप्लाई साइड को आपने कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज से somehow कनेक्ट करना है तो अगर आप स्टार्टिंग के अंदर एक छोटा सा ऐसे लिख लेते हैं where you explain comparative in terms of opportunity cost, in terms of, in terms of efficiency, in terms of productivity, so फिर आपने हर पॉइंट को लेके सप्लाई साइड को बार बार दिस इज हाउ वी विल बी एबल टू अचीव द कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज. ओके. And then you have to, for a level three, you have to write about the potential problems of government. बहुत सिंपल है वही सप्लाई साइड. आपने एजुकेशन और ट्रेनिंग जो दी है वो लोगों को उस पर्टिकुलर इंडस्ट्री के हिसाब से नहीं दी है या ये पॉलिसीज जो है बहुत टाइम लगाती हैं फॉर अ कंट्री टू डेवलप कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज. बट द वे कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज इज नॉट एन easy thing to achieve. It takes years, and it takes years of policies and a consistent policies from the government's point of view. तो आपने उसी हर इंडिविजुअल पॉलिसी जो ऊपर डिस्कस की है ना उसको काउंटर करनी है बेसिकली एंड हाउ इट मे नॉट हेल्प. यू नो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की आपने बात की दैट आपने इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर डेवलप किया बट टर्न्स आउट कि भाई आपने जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर लगाया है दैट माइट नॉट बेनिफिट अस बिकॉज it's not connecting the road links in any way. So वो सारा जो आपने इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बनाया है वो तो which you spent on is not linked with the mining and all. आपने रोडे बना दी हैं. लेट्स सपोज गवादर पोर्ट आपने पूरे पोर्ट बना दिए हैं. आपने रोड्स बना दिए हैं लेकिन आपने फोकस वो नहीं किया कि माइनिंग में एक्सट्रैक्शन कैसे होगी. नाउ यू आर स्टिल रिलाइंग ऑन द फॉरेनर्स टू कम एक्सट्रैक्ट टेक दोज रिसोर्सेज टू देयर ओन कंट्रीज. बाय द वे ये पूरा सीपेक का सिचुएशन है पाकिस्तान के अंदर दैट our entire Chinese investment is on the infrastructure, but it's not about how ग्वादर एंड बलूचिस्तान की ये जो मेन चीजें हैं उसको हम कैसे यूज कर सकते हैं. तो उसके लिए फिर अब हम we're relying on Barrick Gold, we're relying on the Chinese corporates to come into Pakistan, extract these, and take all of that unrefined stuff, minerals and all, on ships and roads to their own respective countries, extract the copper and the gold and the rare mineral earths and all of that, and then sell it at high prices all over the world. So from us, they're just extracting at cheap rates. जो low income countries का problem है, and then they're going to refine it and sell it at a higher price all over. So that's the unfortunate part of that. But anyhow. So do look at this marking scheme. And even if a government successfully creates a comparative advantage in a particular sector, global competition can erode that advantage. So even after doing these policies, we may not still be performing at the level of the world. फिर गवर्नमेंट पॉलिसीज की आपको पता है कुछ अनइंटेंडेड कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस होते हैं. which can hurt the country. For example, अगर आप interest rate कम करते हैं तो foreign investments कम हो जाती हैं, and that might hurt our key raw material imports and bring inflation and may bring unemployment. So, it's a very vast question. इसको later on, I think we will get an opportunity to look at again. Um, but the main thing for this, there are two main things in this particular essay that you have to focus on. One, the essay needs to deal with government policies, and two, those policies will either benefit or hurt the comparative advantage. So ये करना जरूरी है ऐसे में. If you don't connect it to the comparative advantage and efficiency and productivity and all, then you are not getting, I would say, more than level 2 4 marks, no matter how much you write in terms of policies and the problems of the policy. If you don't factor in the whole idea of comparative advantage, you can never get level 3 answer. All right.